Hello, this is Scott, our second episode of Scott in the System. And today I have my longtime friend and colleague, Dave Volkowski, the Executive Director of Disability Advocates. I'm so glad you could make it today.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to having some fun conversations, as we always do.
Oh, yes, indeed. Our first topic today will be about independent living, of course, which is the heart and soul of disability advocates, would you say?
Well, absolutely. You know, I mean, as you know, we were first called the Grand Rapids Center for Independent Living. And so it's all about that, helping folks with disabilities identify and set their dreams and their goals for themselves, and then helping folks knock down the barriers that are between them and their goals and dreams.
Okay. Do you think the civil rights movement was the beginning for independent living?
Absolutely. You know, that the civil rights movement of the 50s and into the 60s clearly showed, you know, that a group of people, African Americans, were totally left out of mainstream America. You know, that some of the more iconic images of people fighting to get to the dining counters, you know, and seeing that reenacted in different movies, where the similarities for people with disabilities is like, well, we can't, you know, eat there either. But the difference was there were 2 or 3 steps at the front door. There was no accessible seating at the food counter, right?
No curb cut.
No curb cuts, no accessible public transportation. So a similar group of people, and of course that there are great overlaps. You know, one thing that I like to say is disability doesn't discriminate.
Yeah, I think you got a sign in your office that says 1 in 5 Americans are disabled.
Yeah, 1 in 5, absolutely. And as I said, it doesn't discriminate, because right now our community's richest person, Mr. DeVos, uses a wheelchair.
Really?
You know, he's aged into his disability. However, you know, he was still at the Econ Club dinner last year, and so he's still active in his own life. He just uses a wheelchair now. So being a billionaire, you still can acquire a disability. So it's...
Oh, gee.
Yeah.
I thought money might solve that.
It doesn't solve it. It might be a little easier for him to hire a personal care attendant. He might be able to pay more than you and me. But that being said, you know, it's a group of people. There were people of all backgrounds, all races that were part of the disability rights movement, as it took lessons learned from the African American community, from the women's rights movement, the American farm workers movement. So all kinds of stuff related to civil disobedience, community organizing, all of that stuff, lessons learned.
Would you say prior to the civil rights movement, most of us in wheelchairs, blind and otherwise, were pretty much institutionalized?
Yeah, if you weren't
That's
institutionalized.
kind of how I foresee it.
Yeah, if you weren't institutionalized, you were almost literally kept in the back bedroom. I mean, the other thing is a lot of folks, you know, to say, unfortunately, died at an early age because medical technology or medical techniques weren't available to help people survive. And probably one of the biggest impetuses for the roots, or, you know, 100 years ago, we unfortunately are celebrating the 100th anniversary of America entering the First World War.
Wow.
Well, at the First World War, more and more people who were injured survived. You know, when you read statistics from the Civil War, more people died from infections from their injuries than their actual injuries on the battlefield. And so as medical practice increased, people were surviving. And then, unfortunately, we got we invented some wicked ways to hurt each other, and a lot of soldiers were blinded because of mustard gas and some of that other stuff, again, that people were experimenting with in the First World War, and so they survived. And the difference between somebody who was born with a disability and, as you said, they were institutionalized or kept into people's homes, their families' homes, they never were taught how to be independent. These were, and again, it was predominantly men, not to be sexist about it, it was real, but these men were independent, they were able-bodied, and they were soldiers, and they came back, and it's like, oh my gosh, what do we do with these folks? And so that was a huge, again, it was a bit of a silver lining to the negativity of war, but we realized that people could acquire disability at no fault of their own. Because that's a whole nother segment or two we could talk about.
The different types of disability.
Different types of disability and how, like, what do people think disability was caused by, and just all of that stuff. But yeah, but the civil rights history is very rich, especially within the disability community, and it's a story that we don't tell enough of.
Okay. Do you think the principle of normalization developed by Wuffenberger was the second key step in this phase?
It definitely was another key, and it's interesting how we've changed the language since then, because normalization, like, what's normal? It's
almost to be the abnormal is the normal.
Right, and so, but in spite of what he labeled it at the time, it was absolutely critical, because it put what's the right word? It put a good framework around what people were saying. It's like, why can't folks with disabilities have a normal life? And what does it take to get those supports to make it happen? It's still focused, again, this was in the 1960s, and so we have to celebrate how cutting edge it was for its time. Today, it's a bit immature in its thinking. However, for its time, it was absolutely cutting edge. Because again, as you pointed out at the outset, it was, you got to go to an institution and you need to be taken care of 100% of the time, as opposed to, no, let's figure out what's needed to help you live a normal life. And so again, extremely cutting edge.
And so, so we're not, the Gordys or whatever in the world who, had to go through those type of things.
Oh, absolutely. You allude to a friend of ours and too many of our friends that now are getting up there in age, they lived too many years in state institutions because that's what their family was given that recommendation. That's the best thing for little Gordy. You won't be able to take care of him, we will. And now, again, we don't have those institutions. Families do get, that's a whole nother conversation, but families do have more supports available, always advocating for additional levels of support and trying to, provide better ones. But yeah, it's unfortunate that people had to live through that.
It was a real eye-opener for me when I moved into the same complex.
Yep.
When I grew up, being my parents were supporting whatever, I thought that was the standard, but it wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't the standard, and unfortunately, that was, actually Geraldo Rivera, of all people, that's how he got his start, or his big break, is he did investigative reporting on some of the state institutions that, unfortunately, to call them hellholes, it was real. Not all of them. Again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but one was too many, and there were many of them that were just terrible. And they showed, they went in there, they showed it, and that too helped, and again, it was Wuffenberger and others who said, okay, instead of this, let's see what we can do, and let's bring people out of the institutions back into the communities, and let's support families or these individuals and their families so that they're not forced to make that choice.
And I thought Geraldo started by looking for the
Al Capone's money. that was a great flop, right? Hopefully people at home remember that one, if they're as old as us. The build up, open up Al Capone's safe. You got to go to YouTube. I'm sure it's out there.
I was so excited that hope he was going to find something.
Something? Al Capone's safe. Yes, he was. He was a real journalist at one time in his life, and then he became something else. And I'll leave it at that. I don't want you to get sued for libel, making fun of poor Geraldo Rivera. We'll stop it right there.
The medicalization movement, thus another component of, or cornerstone of independent living physiology, became the shift away from the authoritarian medical model to a paradigm of individual empowerment and responsibility for owning, defining, and meeting one's own needs. Did this allow the disabled to start taking ownership of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, that whole thing about we call it the medical model versus the independent living or the IL model, it's still a huge area of discussion.
So basically this was saying not allowing the medical and professional community to make our decisions for me.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And the other, the bigger frame to say that you're broken and the medical professionals will fix you, as opposed to no,
I'm still waiting.
Yeah, and the community's broken in the sense that we don't have curb cuts, we don't have 24/7 public transportation, we don't have enough employment opportunities and the supports to make employment possible. And so definitely there's been huge strides into, as you pointed out, or called it, the demedicalization of disability. At the same time, there's still huge opportunities. And that's, that's all of us. Luckily, myself, I haven't had to deal with doctors too much. My wife does a little bit more, but sometimes you just, and again, sometimes you feel like you're a number, right? The doctor quickly, here, just take this medicine, it'll fix you, and it's just,
yeah, we became a prescription-driven society.
Yeah, so there's a lot that we have to do, and there's a lot of good stuff happening too. Again, don't get me wrong, a lot of great stuff happening, and at the same time making sure that, I like to say it's called the practice of medicine because they're practicing.
Yeah.
They get to practice on you more than me,
Yeah.
right? And as we figure this out, they're not know-alls, can't solve everything with a pill, but we're getting better.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and the most critical piece that you hit on at the end is who's really controlling those decisions and how is it impacting, and so we'll leave it at that for now.
How would you describe consumerism philosophy encouraged by Ralph Nader played a role in our choices and freedoms of today, or as they call it, Raiders Nader, or Nader's Raiders?
Well, yeah, again, it was this group of folks and him at the lead saying, we need to ask the questions and we need to demand quality. That we're the customer in this equation, and not that the customer's always right or the customer's always king or queen, but people like to put that, over their door. If you're a business, the customer's the customer's king, the customer's queen. And Ralph Nader pointing out, well, they gave the king and queen a pretty dangerous vehicle, right? You know, back to the Corvair. And what's that part of it? So again, it taught us to be, A, become educated consumers, and B, it taught us that as consumers, we can demand good quality, safe products. So it's definitely, you know, weaving into the tapestry that's the disability rights movement.
How would you compare the independent living paradigm developed by Gerben D. Young to Wolfensberger theory?
As I was alluding to, is, you know, again, it's that idea where Wolfenberger being one of the first, we can, again, we need to celebrate it for how cutting edge it was. However, for its time. And then other people built on it. They said yes and. It wasn't yes but, it was yes and. You know, not only do we need to provide these opportunities, what are the other supports? And looking at, you know, the independent living movement and the independent living paradigm predominantly focuses on the like what are the barriers of the exterior world? And, you know, we're going to keep going back to the litanies of where are the curb cuts, are there elevators, public transportation, ramps, accessible housing. You know, the list goes on, but that's the problem. The problem isn't your wheelchair. Your wheelchair works just fine, right? It just doesn't climb steps. So the problem's the step, not your wheelchair, but we see wheelchair. You know, as a funny aside, and it was actually in the state capitol with another friend of ours, Clark Goodrich, that, you know, people like to say you're wheelchair bound. But it's like, not to sound too politically correct, but you're actually wheelchair freed. Because without the wheelchair, you would be like earthbound, right? You'd have to sit there.
Yeah, because the chair has a leg, leg's not wheels.
Right, it frees you to come here and to wander through the community, as we were talking about using mainline bus. So, but if we said wheelchair freed, people would say, oh, that's so politically correct. No, it's just correct. And so again, looking at that wider perspective, what's really broken, what's not broken, what can we fix together? So.
Yeah, I like how he says it's good. It's better to call it a power chair, not electric chair.
Yeah.
Sounds like you can get electrocuted.
You get electrocuted, and it's power. This is my power to access the community.
In 1974, Wade Blank founded the Atlantis Community, a model for community-based, consumer-controlled, independent living. Would you consider this the first form of the CIL?
Actually, I mean, the first CIL was in Berkeley, California.
Okay.
And we're going to talk with about Ed Roberts.
Yeah.
But what they did in Denver was to take it a few more levels further, where, you know, how do folks really live together in community?
This was Wade's area.
Yeah, in Atlantis.
Okay.
And you know, they definitely did a fair amount of protesting in Berkeley, California, but Denver is where the disability rights group and movement really took it to the streets.
Yeah, I think we should tell our viewers as well, prior to him doing this, he worked in the nursing home.
Yep.
I guess nursing home, and he helped liberate these persons that were in the nursing home.
Yep.
And this is what really, you know, I thought was fantastic. He was a caregiver for like 9, 10 different individuals.
Yep.
And he was doing it on his own free will.
Yep.
You know, no pay or whatever, like your, you know, caregiver would get today.
Yep. Yeah. And so the Atlantis community was that. It was about people of all ability levels living together. And, so it was very positive. And out of that, I mean, Wade also was part of the protest that began ADAPT. I mean, ADAPT originally stood for Americans with Disabilities for Accessible Public Transportation. And they, I thought I put on airport. But anyway, sorry, on that quick phone ring. But anyways, that they blockaded a city bus. And, back to the lunch counters that weren't accessible for African Americans because of their race, physically inaccessible to people with disabilities, public transportation was the same. And we've moved from it, but at one time, ADAPT would hold signs, I can't even get on the bus, let alone the back of the bus. So not trying to compare or steal thunder from the civil rights movement, but to add thunder to it. It's like we need to create a better bus for everybody.
Yeah, because that was a prerequisite for that.
Yep.
About the buses, what's her name, Rose?
Yeah, Rosa Parks?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that led the disabled to think, hey, if she's doing it, why not us?
Yep, and they couldn't boycott the bus because he couldn't get on it, so they barricaded or blockaded the bus, and they had this bus downtown Denver. There's actually a plaque on the road where it says, at this place is where, which led to, at this place, the bus was just surrounded by people with disabilities, and people were chaining themselves to the bus and said, we're not letting the bus go until we can get on it.
Wow, I'd love to see that on YouTube.
Yeah, and then it led to, the federal changes. I mean, now if you buy a bus, it must, full stop, it must be accessible. And, if it's a lift or a ramp, the bus must be accessible.
Wow.
So, and that had the roots with Wade Blank and a few dozen other people chaining themselves to a bus in Denver.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so grassroots.
That's real. That's right.
Wow. I don't know if I would be that brave, I should say. Wow. Would you consider Ed Roberts one of the forefathers of the independent living?
Yeah, I mean, I call Ed Roberts the grandfather of the independent living movement. That he definitely, there was a small group of folks, again, it was at the University of California in Berkeley, that got on campus, and without telling you the whole story, that he was the leader of that group.
I think we should tell our viewers as well, he suffered from polio.
Yep.
So while he was a student at Berkeley, he had to have a respirator.
Yep.
And we're talking the 1960s.
Yep.
At the time I showed this, I hope I could have an image, but I would assume a respirator from the 1960s had to be like a window air conditioner.
Oh yeah.
So it's not real mobile.
Well, and when he slept in an iron lung.
Oh.
And so that they called themselves the Rolling Quads because a couple other guys with quadriplegia were, on campus, and the only place they could find was an abandoned wing of the medical school hospital that was strong enough to hold the weight of the iron lung.
Oh.
And so they put these guys in that, and again, they came together and they started saying, hey, the world has to be better. Again, people finding each other that have similar needs, similar barriers. And and as you mentioned, Ed learned how to suck air out of the respirator. I mean, again, because of his polio, he wasn't able to breathe at all. And so he, there's a classic 60 Minutes article, again, you can find it on YouTube, or I don't know if CBS has it archived on their website, but just Ed Roberts talking about his story And he's part of the interview, he's in his iron lung. Part of the interview, he's rolling around Berkeley, and then again, sucking air out of that respirator.
Yeah, maybe I could work some of those clips in.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. How much did the ADA being signed into law play a role in independent living?
It's been a massive, massive improvement. Again, it makes illegal the discrimination and calls it discrimination against people with disabilities or excluding people with disabilities. It says if people with disabilities can't access your goods and services, that's discrimination. And so with the ADA, we're celebrating the 27th, well, we celebrated the 27th anniversary of the ADA last week on July 26th. And over the last 27 years, we've seen great improvement. Still at least another 27 years worth of work to make real the goals and the vision that the ADA encompasses. However, the best thing about the last 27 years is everybody who was alive then is now 27 years older. And because of that, unfortunately, we've dealt with aging parents, aging grandparents. We may have acquired our own disabilities, our own children with disabilities. And so when it becomes me instead of you, it takes on a different sense of urgency, we'll say. And so then the ADA was that framework for people to utilize to say, no, we need an accessible community. Let's work on this. And it lays out, here's what accessible employment means, here's what accessible government services, here's what accessible goods and services. So again, it gives us that framework to advocate within and to live within.
Yeah, I guess I feel kind of frustrated. It's not better in the aspect of, public accessibility being, for public transportation and far as the requirements of the city to have curb cuts and such
Right.
are one thing, but when it comes to accessing a public building, it's a whole different story.
Yep, and yeah, the advantage of newer construction, we try to engage the developer and builder community so that they're not only trying to comply with the ADA, which has to be seen as the floor, not the ceiling. It's not the most you can do, it's the least you must do. And so there's additional accessibility that, one thing that's, for instance, that's not in the ADA is to have a single-use unisex restroom, where that takes advantage of, my own parents. My mom ended her life using a wheelchair, but my dad was her caregiver.
Yeah, that makes it challenging out in public.
Right, and my dad, he was sometimes not shy, and so he would just open up the women's bathroom and say, "Hey, ladies, I'm coming in," and they'd kind of freak out, but they'd see my mom in a wheelchair, and they'd say, "Oh, okay," and so he'd help my mom go to the bathroom, and at the same time, they liked traveling up north, and he had literally mapped out where those accessible unisex restrooms were, so he would know where my mom could go to the bathroom with his help without, again, you're still going to feel a little embarrassed no matter how gruff you try to be or say, I don't care. You care. You just hide it better than others. And there's a solution. When my daughter was little, a bathroom, again, I don't have to go into the women's bathroom. I don't have to take her into the men's. Issues now about, and I totally support it personally, gender identity, and that if we had a unisex restroom, it doesn't matter, just use it,
Exactly.
But instead it's men and women, so there's a disability thing that actually solves all kinds of other issues that we have as a community.
It's a barrier breaker, more or less.
Absolutely. So.
if you were to make another Mount Rushmore, what four faces would you put on it in relation to independent living? I suppose you could put yourself in.
Oh, no. Well, maybe. I mean, I like this question, you know. I mean, the other ones, I don't say they're more factual, but this one I really, it was good to think about. I mean, Ed Roberts is first. When independent living, again, Ed Roberts is there.
I would have to put Wade there too.
Well, Wade's
almost.
going to be close. So there's two. The third one, a person who doesn't get as much
Recognition.
yeah, is a woman named Judy Heumann.
I never heard of her.
Yeah, see, and
Shame on me.
she was definitely there when the first Center for Independent Living was started in Berkeley. You know, yeah, one of her funny stories. She was actually an undersecretary in the Department of Education during the Clinton administration. So she helped found the World Institute on Disability. So she was doing all kinds of great stuff. And the funny story is, and she had some severe physical impairments. So she was sitting in the story, I don't know if it's true or not, but as it goes, she was sitting in an airport holding a cup of coffee waiting for her flight. Like she is an undersecretary in the Department of Education, and somebody walks by and puts a handful of change in her cup, thinking she was begging. And she's like, "You just ruined my cup of coffee, buddy." You know? But Judy, definitely I would put on the wall, or on Mount Rushmore. The fourth one, though, is I would put a big old mirror. That's where I would get on there. Because that's independent living, is you have to see yourself as part of the change makers.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not about Wade or Ed or Judy, it's about Scott and Dave and everybody else. How are we working together? We are all in this together, you know? It's not
About ourselves.
right. We're not in it by ourselves. However, we are part of it. And so we have to truly see ourselves. So if we had a big old mirror on Mount Rushmore, you know, that could be scary. It's like, oh, if you saw me. But other than that, you see yourself as part of that. Because that, again, that's what this is about. You know, I mean, some of the employment stuff we do, the only magic in our employment stuff is we teach people who's in charge of their lives. Who's in charge of your life? You are. And here's some opportunities, guidelines, here's some techniques how you can get and keep control of your life, and how you identify, again, your dreams and how to knock down barriers. But you're the one in charge, not me. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to make anything happen that's going to have any lasting impact. So again, I would love to see a big old mirror on Mount Rushmore.
I would have never thought you'd say that.
Well, there you go. So you and I together will sit next to each other and look up at the mirror. 5 faces. All right.
Would you recommend a disabled community living independently to join the NCIL, which I thought was NCIS?
That's right. You know, I would invite people with disabilities to join something. If NCIL, National Coalition for Independent Living, if that's your thing, join it. Down Syndrome Association locally, there's Down Syndrome Association of West Michigan, join it. Disability Advocates of Kent County, come join us. ARC, Kent County, the RIC, you know, there's all kinds of disability organizations. Find one, get involved, and we'll get back on your show later this year when we have more specificity to talk about it, but how are we coming together? As a quick example, our ADA celebration this year, and even though the actual date was last week, we're not celebrating till August 30th, right down the street from your house at the Kentwood Library.
Really?
Yep, so the Kentwood Library, August 30th at 4 o'clock. And one of the coolest things for me is there's like 15 disability organizations that are co-sponsoring it. We're all coming together. This isn't Disability Advocates event, it's not Down Syndrome event, it's all of us coming together, because the ADA is about all of us.
Something tells me Scott and the system better have cameras rolling that day.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you for the information.
Cool.